Hello everyone, welcome to the tutorial. So as you can see, I have a basic project setup. It has a first person controller which we can actually use to see how our crafting system is looking, just to save us some time. So first thing I want to do is create a UI as a holder for our radial crafting system. Now I like to keep my project clean, so I just disable rake as target for the objects which I know are not going to be interactable on the UI. You can keep it enabled, it doesn't change much other than the interactivity of the UI element, so it's totally up to you. Now that we have the visual for our radial crafting system, next thing we want are the actual items or the recipes which are going to appear on the system. So for that, we will create a simple UI. For the sake of tutorial, I will just use a text to show the item name. You can change the images, add more items or properties however you require it later on. Now that we have a basic placeholder for our crafting recipes, next thing we want to go is start creating actual scripts. So let's get right into it. First, I will create a script which I am going to use on the items. I just called it Craftable Item UI. You can name it anything you want. And I will add it on the crafting visual placeholder which we just created. So basically, this script will be responsible for setting up the UI for this holder and initializing its value, fetching its cost, and whatever extra functions you want in it. Now I use a namespace to keep my script structured. You can use it if you want, it is not necessary. So first thing we want is to get the reference of all the UI components which we want to change on runtime. Now I will go back to the Unity editor and I will create another script which will basically be a scriptable object which will hold all the recipes which we are going to craft or items, whatever you want to call it. Basically, we will use it to modularly expand our system so we can add as many items as we want later on and remove them as well easily without going to the code. Now, I have just created a simple script that there is nothing in it. So first thing which I want to do is create a custom struct which will hold all the properties for our craftable recipes. So let's get on to it. So as you can see, it has some basic properties here. I don't need item ID. You can use it for specifying the items later if needed. And basically we don't have a description right now, so we'll remove that. And sprite as well you can define here if you need it, but for the tutorial we don't need it. Now what we do need is the type of resource which it requires to craft the item. So basically I will create an enum which will hold all the resources which we can use for crafting an item. So as you can see, there are some basic resource types here, but I will add one more just to show how it's done. So basically, let's say I want to add scrap to it. I will just extend it over here. Then we can use it for all the crafting recipes. Similarly, in future, if you want to add something or remove something, you can just add it here and it will add a new type of property. So how this works is basically in our struct, we will define a craftable resource type, which will be used to identify which type of resource we need, and we can use the same type in our inventory system if you create one in future to identify it like this type of resource is required. So let's not overcomplicate things. We can also create an array for this to add multiple type of resources, but for the sake of tutorial, I will not do it. I will simply use one type of resource for our crafting system in tutorial. So basically, I have created an array of craftable items, and what we want to do is mark it as serializable, so it will show up in the inspector. So basically, what it does is it forces our struct to be serializable, which allows Unity Inspector to draw it, and we can easily edit its values over there. Now, I will create a method to get the items. I can simply use getters and setters as well here, as you can see. But I am going to use a method because in case if I need to add further filtering or any other specific conditions or extra return times, I can add it here in the future. So I will simply return our craftable items. So this is it for our basic scriptable method. We can expand over it however we want. It's modular, we can easily edit it, it won't break anything, and it don't have much dependencies. Now on our craftable item UI. Now, next thing which we want to do is create an initialize method in our craftable item UI script. And basically we will pass craftable item in it, which is a custom struct we just created. Now I will change its type to internal since I want to access it outside the script. So whatever initialization you want to do, let's say for item name and item cost, it's already there, but we can add it further for our image type. Basically, if there is some custom image you define for that item, you can add an image here and you can basically initialize that image over here. And whatever extra things you need to initialize, you can expand it further here. So what we want to do right now is create a enum here, which will be our craftable resource type. So basically what we will use this is for identifying which type of resource we need to craft that certain uh, recipe or item, whatever you want to call it. And basically using this, we will fetch the items from our inventory system or resource system, whatever you have. For the sake of tutorial, we are just going to create a temporary script later on. And yeah, based on that, you can determine whether we have enough resources or not to craft a certain item. As I said earlier, you can create an array of whatever you want for multiple items, but for the tutorial, let's go with this. So next thing which we want to do is actually get the type of resource it requires to be crafted. So I will just declare it over here. And as I mentioned earlier, you can create an array or a custom struct to add multiple resource type. But for the tutorial, we are just going with a single resource type. And the other thing which we will need is to compare the cost of this item and check the type of resource. So for that, we will require an inventory system or a resource management system of some kind to get the type of resource which we need. But as we don't have any of that right now, I will just create a temporary script later. So we will get onto that part later on. So for now, I will just declare a int to store the item cost. And on the initialize, we are just adding those two values. With this, the basic setup for craftable item UI is done. So what we will do next is basically create our ring crafting system manager, which will actually spawn those items on the ring in a radial format and which will handle all those items, how they are crafted, whatever we are crafting, and all other settings. So let's get into it. So right now I have created a script called radial crafting system. So basically, you can attach it to an empty object or you can directly attach it to the canvas as well. But I prefer to attach it on an empty object so we can later access it easily without any extra dependencies. So I will do that. First thing we want here is to get the access to craftable item UI script, which we have created, so that we can instantiate it. So I will just declare a variable for that. And second, we want a transform where we want to instantiate it. Now that we have these two objects, next thing we want is to create a system which will instantiate these in a radial order. So for that, I will just create a method and I will also get a reference for this scriptable object. So instead of getting reference directly, you can also use resources.load if you are keeping it in the resource file. So what that does it, you simply don't have to assign it every time and it saves a little bit of RAM for you, but I don't think it matters much. So in my case, I will just going to keep it like this. Although if you have a big array of elements, I would recommend using resources.load since it would be much manageable. Before proceeding further, what I want to do is get a unique item ID for each craftable element. So if you remember our craftable item SEO, over here on the craftable items, I will basically declare an enum. So you can add whatever items you want here, which are going to be craftable. Let's say in my case, for example, I will add a molotov and then I can add a pipe bomb maybe. And similarly, you can expand it however much you want. Now over here under craftable item struct, I will define that enum. So basically we will use this to identify which type of craftable are we crafting and whatever values we will define, this will be a unique identifier. Now I will switch to Unity editor once more and what I want to do is under our crafting item, we will add a button which will basically handle input responses. And over here, I will just get a reference for it. You can also use get component if you want, but I am keeping it like this for the tutorial. And what I will do is create a action here, which we will call on button click. I'm using Unity events since they are easier to manage. You can also use a normal raw action or a delegate, whatever you prefer. Now, basically, what this question mark does is it checks for null elements. So if there are no events assigned to it, it will just check for the null elements and not throw an error. And on the start, I will simply assign it on click. So you can directly use an anonymous method here as well if you want, but I think this is more manageable in case I want to add more things in future. So I'll keep it like that. Now that we have an event for input, we'll proceed with the generation. So first thing I want is to get the list of the items which we defined in the scriptable object. And for that, we have already created a method. So let's use that. And I will also rename it for the clarity purpose. So with this, we now have a list of items which we want to instantiate. Then we will simply loop through and generate those. So basically, what we are doing here is initializing the items with the initialize item method, where it takes the craftable item as the parameter and we will get the value from here. So it will just instantiate each item, and after instantiating it, it will basically initialize all the properties over there, which we have defined on the scriptable object. Now, what we want is to define a method here, which will basically handle when any item is stepped on. So let's just do it. Now over here, we are passing a craftable item as parameter. Basically, what I will do here is create an anonymous method. If you want, you can also add a parameter as an overload on the add list on the Unity event which we defined, but I will not do that. I will just simply add an anonymous method for the simplicity of it. Now in this method, we will handle whatever input we want to handle, like basically checking if we have enough resources to craft, or whether or not we have reached max inventory space if there is any, etc. So before proceeding further with this method, we would need an inventory manager or resource manager basically, which we don't have. So we will continue when we create that script. Now this should handle the instantiation of the objects. But what we want is not to instantiate those inside an object. We want it to be assigned in a radial position based on our distance and number of items. So let's just code that. So what this float does is basically it will give us a distance from the center of the radial circle which we have in the Unity editor to the position of the item where we need to place this item. And once it does, what we will do is place multiple items there and then rotate it around the origin point. So what it does is get the direction and multiply the distance to where we want to place the object. And for the rotation, what we can do is we can get the direction vector and align it along the side. So what it does is basically convert the direction vector into the quaternions, so we can assign it as a rotation. And now what we want is to rotate that item and distribute it at the proper angle based on number of items. For that, we will just calculate it by dividing it by 360 with the number of items. So basically, we will use rotate around to rotate our object around a pivot, which would be the center. Now, what we will do is instantiate it on the start cell. If you have some custom script or game manager, you can use it to call it whenever you want. But for now, we will just do it at the start. Then we will switch back to the Unity editor. Now over here, we'll quickly do the assignments. And I will create a prefab for our craftable items. You can remove it or you can keep it here. I usually keep it inside the parent itself just to check the reference and change the sizes and all later on. So I will just disable it for now. And for the craftable items scriptable object, I will simply create a scriptable object inside here. You can rename it and name it whatever you want, but I will keep it like that for now. And over here, you can see we can add as many items as we want. So for the item name, I can name it like, let's say Molotov for this. And whatever the cost of item is, let's say 100. And for instance, you can select whatever materials you want. I will give it to the wood for now. And let's say I want to add another element. I will simply rename it. Let's say it's a bomb. And I will change it to pipe bomb. And I will change the type to scrap basically. So just like that, you can add and remove items easily here once you are done with the system. And now what we will do is simply drag and drop the reference of craftable items here. This distance is something we will need to figure out by playing the game. So let's say it should be around, if I were to look at it, 150, I think. Now what we want to do is we will change the rotation direction here. Basically, vector 3 dot up is rotating it on the y-axis, but what we want is to rotate it on the z-axis. So I will just do transform vector 3 dot forward. Also, what the look direction is doing, it is assigning it to the z-axis. But what we want is to assign it to the y-axis. So I will just expose a vector 3. You don't actually need to expose it, but I'd like to keep it exposed in case I want to edit it later. So I will just name it rotation offset and I will add it here. So basically I'm just adding it to the Euler angles. Yeah, I think I am happy with this. So as you can see, it's right now visible in our radial crafting menu and it is already assigning its rotation. Now that we have basic radial system set up, what we want to do is create that temporary inventory or resource manager, whatever you want to call it. So for the sake of the video, let's just make a simple script. I will call it resources manager. The better way for it would be to create a custom struct. You can also use a class actually. If you want to modify resources on runtime, I would recommend that, depending on your use case, since we can only initialize struct on a constructor. So as you remember, we created a custom enum called craftable resources. So we'll just use that here. Ideally, you should create your resource type under the resource manager script if you have any, but for the tutorial, we will just go with that. And over here, we can define our default amount. And I will just make this class serializable so I can edit it in inspector. Now you can add additional properties here as per your need, but we don't need to do any of that. I will just add the comparison on our script over here. Like if you remember, I mentioned that we can create a boolean method here, which will basically determine whether we can use that item to craft based on the resources we have. So as you can see, we already have resources required defined here along with the item cost. So we don't need any additional parameter here. But if you want, you can add it externally, like overload it with a parameter. If I want to check for some specific resource as well, then override. But we don't need to do that. So I will proceed with this. As for the resource manager, if it's required, you can make it a singleton. So it have an helper class, which basically creates a singleton. So what it does is just simply take the mono behavior and create a static instance with an awake method. For the tutorial, I will just keep it like that. You don't have to make it a singleton. It depends on your structure entirely. But since I want to keep it single, I will just use it as a singleton. Now over here, we can simply get the reference. Now, this is not an ideal way to get the amount, and it could obviously lead to errors if we don't have that type of resource, etc. And it should be there in the resource manager. But that is not the focus of the tutorial. So for the simplicity, I will just use this. If you want a tutorial on inventory system, you can let me know in the comments. I will just create that as well. So basically what this will do is, it will just let us know if we can craft an item or we cannot craft an item. Now, this, I think we have done with all the basic setups. We want the control to basically enable and disable the radial crafting system. So I will just add that here. And I am using the doTween library for training. If you are not aware, you can check it out. It's a very good library for animation, especially if you are familiar with the code base. You can do a lot of things with it other than animation as well, but that is not the focus of the video. So let's leave it for now. Now I will create a canvas group over here. If you want, you can use a canvas group. I think scaling animation would be better in this case, so I will just use scaling instead. So what it does is, it will basically animate our radial system to scale from 0 to 1 or 1 to 0 based on our visible state. And you can also add another check, which is called from. So it will always ensure that it's scaling from 0 or 1. So I think this should be it for our basic visual animation. Now, in my case, I have a first person controller, which is disabling the mouse input. So what I want to do is enable it again. So I will just create a reference for the player here. You don't need to follow this step. It's just for my specific requirement. What this does is basically stops all the input for the player. And I also want to show the cursor as well. This should be all for my player's script. Again, this step is not necessary for you. I just need to do it because of my first person controller. And the set cursor visible just simply sets the cursor visible or invisible. That's all it is. So with this, our basic setup for showing and disabling crafting system is also done. So we can call it from anywhere. We can just use a bool to set it visible or inactive. You can add additional checks here. Like if it's already opening or already closing, we should not call it again, etc. in case players spam. But that is for the later part. So we will just keep it simple for now. So I will just use a key to toggle it under the update function. As you can see, ActiveServe also works here, but what is the better approach is we can simply declare a bool over here, which will determine whether it's visible or not, then access it while enabling it. So, but for now, we will keep it like this to keep the tutorial simple. Now I will go back to Unity and wait, by default, we want to disable the crafting system. And over here, instead of game object, what we will use is a visual object. Now if I play it, I can simply move around. Then I can use I to toggle my inventory. Now as you can see right now overlay is also expanding, but ideally we don't want that behavior. So what I will do is basically simply remove it from this object and create another parent for overlay or but let's keep it that like that for now since it does not matter in our tutorial. Now that this is working, let's go ahead and finish the final step, which is adding the conditional for when the crafting is successful and generating the items. So right now, as you can see, we have already created a method to check if the item is craftable or if the item is not craftable. And we are passing the reference to the item here already, which is assigned there. So we can directly compare if the item is craftable. Before that, we need to do one more thing. That is to actually create the list of item UIs. So let's just do that. And on the start, we will just assign it. To be fair, we should assign it before the generation itself. So let's just add it here. And over here, we can just add the item after instantiating it. Now with this, you can maintain a list of items which are craftable and you can get those for later use, like whatever values you need, you might need it to access it. So let's say unlock some craftables or lock some craftable or whatever other reason you might have. And now here we will just compare our generated items. So basically what we are doing here is iterating through the list and checking if there is any item which is required, which has a research required type of this type. If not, we will simply get a null value. So we can add a null check here. And if there is a target item, which is basically craftable, so we will just check if we have enough resources to craft it. Now, if we can craft it, what we want to do is remove that resource from our resource system. But as it is not part of tutorial, I will leave it be for now with a comment. And after that, we need to add it to an inventory. So we can simply add something like resource manager dot get your item and then increase it. So if you have a proper working resource manager, you can use it to craft that item. And one more thing which you want to do is give the player feedback that your item is crafted or not. So basically, that we are going to do right now. We will need a UI for that. And after that, we will just show a feedback that your crafting is successful or you get XYZ item. So you can beautify the pop-up however you want. You want a different header, description title, you can add it as per the need. But let's keep it simple for now. And if you want, you can add a button over here to press OK or continue or however you want it. But for now, I will just disable it automatically after some time. Ideally, you should create a separate script for the pop-up and make it a generic pop-up. But for this tutorial, I will not do that since we have already wasted so much time on modularity. So let's just quickly finish it. I will create a separate method for it. Ideally, you should expose those strings or maybe create another constant variable. But let's just do it here quickly. We can also add the item name here later, like which item we have crafted, however amount we crafted, which can be defined over here. But let's just leave it for now. So these two feedback should be enough. And we can simply set it. And after that, after some delay, we want to disable our object. So I will simply create a coroutine for that. Let's say I want to display that feedback for 3 seconds for now. You can definitely expose it and edit it later from the inspector. And also we need to use system.collections for that. You can alternatively expose what type of yield data you want here, but I will just use collections since it's simpler. So yeah, that should be it for our crafting. Let's just call our visual feedback here. And if we cannot craft it, we will simply just show a negative feedback. And after that, we want to disable crafting menu. And additionally, if you want, you can simply call set crafting false by default on start itself in case you want it to be enabled by default, or in case you forgot to disable it later on, it's a safe check. But for now, I will leave it be. Now, if I test it, so as you can see, it's coming up properly and it's disabling as well. And yeah, if you notice, we cannot clearly see the animation right now because we are simply deactivating the game object before the animation, but that's fine. If you want to change it, you can simply call it an on complete, so it will fix it. Now, before testing actual crafting, we want to add the resource manager here since we don't have it right now. And another here. Let's say I will add one of each type and I will give myself a good amount. Now, if I play it, go to the inventory and click on the Molotov, and there is an issue. So basically, what this issue is, The ith index which we are currently assigning is not actually there because once this method is called, the value of I has been increased. So to fix it, what you can simply do is you can store a reference of the item. Let's just say this issue happens in a lot of scenarios if you actually work with the loops, especially with the for loops. If you are directly assigning some anonymous call with the ith index, it's generally better to get a reference for that object early on and assign it via local variable. So in that case, it should fix the problem which we are facing right now. Okay, so it's simply doing the opposite of what we want. So we will just change the condition here. Start coroutine here. Let's start coroutine over here. And then we will return because we don't want to execute it once we have successfully crafted. So earlier what was happening is basically we were crafting it successfully, but then we were showing feedback of -1 as well, and then we were going back. So yeah, that was the issue. Another common thing which can be missed sometimes. What else? Started. Now if I go to inventory and I craft, I can successfully craft my Molotov and it should disable in a buy. And if I go to bomb, it should also craft bomb as well. If I were to set the amount 0, for example, it will simply show a negative feedback. And once again, it's disabling immediately. But the issue is related to that problem, which is not the main focus of tutorial. So I will leave it like that for now. So basically, this should cover our radial crafting system initially. And over there, you can then add the items to the inventory, remove it from the resource manager, you can show the crafting feedback, and whatever else you want over here. This method is fine over here. And yeah, this should basically cover our modular system. And let's say if I want to add more items here, I can simply go to my resources, crafting, and I can simply add whatever items I want. Let's say some item is here, and another item is there. And remember to change these types. You can edit in the enum, whatever resources you require, whatever the cost they prefer. And if I play it, you can actually see now there are 4 items which are equally assigned in radial format. And similarly, you can add an n number of items. You can remove that, and you don't need to go to the code, and it's modular and expandable. So yeah, that's it, guys. Thank you for watching. If you have any feedback, please leave it in the comments and consider subscribing if you like it.